How Empathy Selling was born. The story begins in 1972 when I was halfway through completing an MBA course at the London Business School. Charles Handy was my tutor. Charles subsequently became known as the leading management guru in the 1990s, but was well known even then for his lateral thinking. I had just been offered a position with McKinsey's in New York after being flown there twice for interviews. When I told Charles about the offer, certainly the dream job of every MBA student at the time, he told me to reject it. Instead, he suggested I start my post-MBA career as a salesperson. He had come to the conclusion that success in business depends on how good you are in one-on-one meetings. And the best way to develop that expertise is to become a salesperson. This is still very sound advice, which I often give to young people starting their business career. I decided to immigrate to Australia and accepted a trainee sales position with International Computers Limited, starting just before the official opening of the Sydney Opera House. 6 months later, I was introduced to the Hum-Wadsworth personality model. It is fair to say that the training program was a moment of epiphany. Up till then, I believed that deep down, all of us were the same. After the training program, I realized how different we all are, particularly in how we react emotionally. I will never forget the first time I used it. Shortly after attending the course, the first tender I had ever seen in my life was put on my desk. I was the most junior of the salespeople, and the system was that all tenders went first of all to the most senior salesperson. If he didn't want to pursue it, he then handed it to number 2. And if he didn't like it, he'd give it to number 3, and so forth. So the tender from the Electricity Commission of New South Wales had been rejected by all 4 of the other salesmen in the team. I didn't know this. Very excitedly and bushy-tailed, went off to the initial meeting with Neville Warner. During the meeting, I noted and discovered the following. First of all, he had a row of pens in his shirt pocket. He wore a horizontally striped tie with a vertical pinstripe shirt. He spoke in a flat, monotonic voice. He had been with the Electricity Commission for 20 years, successfully completed several projects, and had been made the IT manager because, in his words, the previous IT manager was a disaster. The CEO had given the job and said, "Neville, fix it." On the office wall, there were several pictures of large generating stations he had worked on. Neville was a classic E or engineer. I went back, read my notes, and I noticed it said 3 things. E's like inspired projects, manuals, and touching the product. So that formed the basis of the sales strategy. In the second meeting with Neville, I took along a manual about the George III operating system, which, now remember this is 1974, used visual display units rather than punch cards to interact with the computer. Several days later, I rang and asked Neville if he had looked at the manual. "Chris, I was up to 3 a.m. reading it last night. Fascinating concepts." And over the next 3 weeks, I took him and his colleagues 7 manuals, and they read every one. Now, part of the purchase process was the running of a benchmark. My plan was for Neville and his team to do it themselves, so they touched the product. I organized for them to go to Woolworths at 4 p.m. in the afternoon with one of our system engineers, Steve, to run the benchmark. The next morning I came into the office. There was no Steve. Somewhat concerned, I rang Neville's office to be told he wasn't in yet. I was now totally puzzled. So I rang Woolworths and said, had they come in? And was then told they were still there. Neville had got on the phone and then told me excitedly, "We've got the benchmark, Chris, down to 14 minutes and 50 seconds. I reckon if we spend another 3 hours on it, we can carve off another 2 minutes. Can we stay?" So naturally, they did the deal. And this was the only account taken off IBM by ICL in the world that year. And when other ICL salespeople, with awe in their voice, would come up to me and say, "How did you do it?" I'd reply that, first of all, I got the decision maker and his team to read 7 manuals, and then I got them to stay all night running benchmarks. Of course, there was amazement in they were just amazed. Later on, I joined TNT, then Australia's largest transport company, as a divisional general manager in charge of payroll management systems, which was aligned to the armored car division. At TNT, they had a selling system based on the number 7. There were 7 basic objections, 7 ways of handling objections, 7 closing techniques, etc. Now, 7 was the magic number because that's the limit of short-term memory. And the idea was that if one close failed, you'd try another one. I said, no, there's a better way. Each of the 7 closes matched up with one of the 7 hum factors. Thus, empathy selling was born. What you do is basically, as I said, use the selling technique which applies to that factor. The division was very successful. In 4 years, we doubled volumes, quadrupled revenues, and increased our bottom line tenfold. In my 4th and final year, the divisional return on investment was 240%. And in the last 18 months, we were involved in 15 tenders. On a market share basis, we should have got maybe 2. We won all 15 tenders. And in one tender, we were 4 times more expensive than our nearest competitor. So I decided to write a book about this technique, and I called it psycho-selling. I sent it off to a dozen publishers. All who rejected it, so I put it in the bottom drawer. I then had my midlife crisis, switched careers, and became an investment banker and then a venture capitalist. I was asked by Alan Unwin to write a book on venture capital and entrepreneurship, which was published in 1989 and is now in fact in its 5th edition. Alan Unwin then asked me if I had another book, and I dragged out the psycho-selling manuscript from the drawer. Unfortunately, it was again rejected with the comment, "Books on selling don't sell." Somewhat irked, I decided I would try a different approach and cold called in 1991 Jill Hickson, who at that time was probably Australia's leading literary agent. She read the book and came back with the following comments. "Chris, this book needs a lot of work. We've got to change the title." On the other hand, the chapter on the hustler is probably the only thing that I've ever read that gets inside the head of my husband, Neville Rand. Her husband, nicknamed Nifty, was then the Premier of New South Wales. No journalist, she said, has ever come close. I couldn't stop laughing about how on the market was. We are going to publish this book. Thus, Empathy Selling was born. Jill convinced Lothian to publish the first edition in 1991, and subsequently Kogan Page in 1992 in the UK and McGraw-Hill in 1995 in Australia brought out subsequent editions. The publishing director of Kogan Page, the largest publisher of business books in Europe, described Empathy Selling as the most innovative book on selling he had read in 10 years. If you want to learn the best personality profiling selling system in the world, invest and read a copy of Empathy Selling.